Alright, what is going on, guys? It is Benny, and today I have the complete Mortarbait guide for you guys, and I've tried to include literally everything in this video, so I have timestamps down below so you can skip through and find whatever you're looking for, or you can just go ahead and watch the full thing, whatever you guys prefer. Now, if you guys do enjoy this video, I would really appreciate a like and maybe a comment, and if you aren't subscribed already, please make sure you do subscribe for more content like this. But at the end of the day, guys, I just hope that you guys find this helpful, and I hope that you enjoy. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Alright, so to start us off, let's go over how to use Mortarbait offensively and all of the tricks that you can use to get damage. Now, when it comes to getting offense with Mortarbait, obviously the most important part is going to be your mortar and where you play it. One of the most common mistakes I see people play, and if you've been watching me for a while, you've probably heard me say this quite a few times, but is when they play the mortar right here at the bridge for no reason. And this is a mistake for a couple reasons. First of all, when you're playing the mortar at the bridge in this location, you can see that your opponent can play a card literally anywhere to kite your mortar and stop it from getting on the tower. The other reason why this is a mistake is because it's very hard to defend your mortar from this location. You can see here my princess tower wouldn't attack the bats until they take the mortar out, so it's not a strong position to defend my mortar from. Instead of playing your mortar in the middle here, where I want to see you play your mortar 90% of the time is going to be right here, one tile back from the bridge, and you can even go a step further and play it one tile to the right. See, from this position, when my opponent plays bats, the bats will actually get taken out by my princess tower or whatever tower troop you're using. So you'll see it's a lot easier to defend from this location than if you were playing in the middle where you get no tower support. Now, the exception to this rule and the other 10% of the time where you might play your mortar in the middle here is when you're up against a card that targets buildings. You can play your mortar right here to pull the card a little bit further and also get a shot off. Now, I wouldn't do this all the time. It's not necessarily the ideal way to defend, but it is a good way where you can defend and get a little bit of offense at the same time if you're in a pinch. This is a strategy that I'll use most commonly against Hog Rider because it allows me to get a little bit of offense and force the player to defend my mortar so that it doesn't get a shot on the tower, while I also stop the Hog Rider from getting a hit. But try to remember, if you're not going to be pulling a card, then you want to play your mortar in this exact position 90% of the time. Now that we have the mortar placement down, I'm going to show you guys how to push with the mortar. And this push, honestly, is all you need to get to Ultimate Champion. If you can get good at doing this consistently, this is going to be enough offense for you to get to Ultimate Champion. So you're going to start your little prince in the back on the same lane. Then you're going to play your knight in front of the little prince. Then you're going to go for your mortar. And that push allows you to both defend the mortar with a tank and have the little prince behind to support. The reason why this push is so important is because it's going to be made available to you multiple times throughout a match. Your knight and your little prince are your two most important defensive cards. So if you can keep them alive and then use a mortar in between them for a push, you're going to be able to have a strong mortar push multiple times throughout a match. Once you have this push down, your supporting cards are what are going to decide what you do next. You'll see here I have my foundational push. I have my knight, my little prince, and my mortar. He's going to go for the battle ram on the left side, which is perfect because I already wanted to play my skeleton barrel on the left side, so I'm going to play my goblin gang and then the skeleton barrel, and already he has two lanes to deal with. He had to sink so much elixir to defend the mortar on the right side that I'm going to get a ton of damage on the left side. And then defending this push on the right side, it's honestly really easy because he didn't get to play his supporting cards for his P.E.K.K.A. I should probably also say that if you're running a different version of Mortarbait that runs Firecracker or Musketeer, you're just doing this exact same push, but instead of Little Prince, you're using one of those cards. Another reason why this push is so important is because you can modify it a bit. You'll see here, I'll use the knight to defend the royal ghost, and then I'm going to go for the mortar. Now I know what you guys may be thinking. Benny, you don't have the little prince there, but that's okay, because I know my opponent is low on elixir, and I do have the knight in front of the mortar, so it's not like he can play something instantly to take it out. And I'm going to get a log with my evil mortar and get a ton of damage here, simply because I used my knight to defend the mortar, and then I went for another mortar. So you can start to modify it. If you don't have a lot of elixir, or if the game is playing very fast, go ahead and either use your little prince or your knight to defend, and then pop a mortar. But if you do have the opportunity to, it's great to have the little prince behind, the knight in front, and then the mortar. If you're ever trying to do this and you're finding that your opponent is countering you with a spell like Rocket, Fireball, Poison, or Tornado with Executioner or Boiler, what you want to do is just play the cards to the left of the mortar to force them to use more counters to pull them all together. That way they can't get a ton of value using one spell only. Another way that you can play your mortar is going to be kind of reactionary, where you play your mortar alone and then you wait and see what your opponent plays to counter it. This is a way that I play my mortar often in the match just to cycle, and I would recommend waiting to see what your opponent's counters are to your mortar and defending anything that they use to kite the mortar. You'll see here my opponent played a building to defend my mortar, and I'm just going to leave it at that. It's an even elixir trade, and there's no point in spending a ton of elixir defending my mortar, and honestly it's just a way to get the match going and have the match cycle. I'm going to teach you guys a little one trick that I love to use when I'm playing my mortar like this. You saw that my opponent has Tesla, and on the first mortar I didn't predict it, and on the second mortar again I'm not going to predict the Tesla. But now that I have my Evil Mortar, I play my Evil Mortar and then I play my Knight in front to predict the building that they play. This often catches them off guard because they think that the Tesla is a safe counter to your mortar and you're not predicting it, so they get comfortable doing it. And then when you have your Evil Mortar, you can punish them by predicting for the Tesla. And you'll see here, I get a mortar lock and I get so much damage that wins me the match. So now that we have the main way to get damage with our mortar figured out, how do we get damage with our other cards and what do we do with them? One of the main ways you're going to be getting damage outside of using your mortar is going to be your skeleton barrel, and so you want to make sure that you utilize it to its fullest potential. I'll show you guys a couple tricks that you can use with skeleton barrel to get some nice chip damage. One of my favorite strategies to use is to play the skeleton barrel with either a goblin gang or a spear goblins right below it. You'll see here I do that, and then the skeleton barrel tanks for the goblin gang, and they have to use a spell to counter the goblin gang below, and then he panics and uses his E-Wiz, so we end up getting some really nice chip damage with our skeleton barrel already. You'll see here again, I'm using the skeleton barrel and I'm backing it up with spear goblins. Every time you're doing this, you're guaranteeing yourself at least a tiny bit of chip damage unless they have arrows. So if they have arrows, try to avoid doing this, but otherwise it's a great way to get damage. You can also play your skeleton barrel in the same lane as your mortar push, just to add a little bit of an extra push and make it a little bit harder for them to counter it. Or if you need to cycle a card, I would just throw it at the bridge and see what your opponent plays to counter. If your opponent is playing Dagger Duchess, try to wait to play your skeleton barrel until you have a counter push that you can use the skeleton barrel in. So one example of this can be using Goblin Gang, as you guys can see here, that will drain the Dagger Duchess ammo. But another thing you can do is just play Spear Goblins, and that will drain the Dagger Duchess ammo to below half, which is enough for your skeleton barrel to get to the tower, or you can use Knight or something else. Now, another great card that you're going to want to use is going to be your Spear Goblins. This might surprise you, but one of the best ways to get damage with this deck is going to be cycling Spear Goblins at the bridge. If you need to cycle a card, or if you just want to get some damage, play your Spear Goblins at the bridge and you're guaranteed at least a little bit of damage. If they don't counter them, then you're going to get about 500, and if they do, then it's really not a big deal, and it's a great way to cycle cards. There are actually multiple times where I will put my Spear Goblins in the opposite lane from my main mortar push, and this is a great example, because you'll see here, I got a mortar shot with my Musketeer and my Knight, but my Spear Goblins did more damage to the tower on the left side than what I got on the right side. Now, another very obvious way that you're going to get a ton of damage is if you're able to log bait them. If you see your opponent use their log at a bad time and you have the elixir to punish them for it, you might as well do it, because you're going to get so much damage off of it, and after all, it is called Mortarbait for a reason. So now that we have the main things for playing your mortar offensively down, how are you going to defend with mortar? When you're playing a defensive mortar, you want to play it right here, one tile to the opposite lane that your opponent is going to be pushing. The reason why you play your defensive mortar one tile to the side of the opposite lane is so that your opponent's card can get pulled and targeted by both of your towers. This defensive mortar placement is going to be pretty much the same for every single matchup. The only time I might change it up is against Balloon. Sometimes Balloon can be a little bit buggy and not get pulled, or it might get pushed by a card like Lava Hound or Minions, so I play it a little bit closer, or I'll even play the Balloon in the same place that I would to defend a Hog Rider up at the bridge. Now that we've gone over where you should play a defensive mortar, it's important that we go over when you should play a defensive mortar, and I have a really great example to explain this. Take a look at a card like P.E.K.K.A, for example. Playing a defensive mortar against a P.E.K.K.A literally makes no sense. 1, because the P.E.K.K.A doesn't target a building, and 2, because a defensive mortar isn't going to make any meaningful damage to a card like P.E.K.K.A. On the contrary, when you look at a card like Barbarians, a mortar can get you a ton of value because the splash damage will help take out those cards. Before you play a defensive mortar, the best way to understand if you should play it or not is to ask yourself these questions. 1. Is the mortar actually necessary to pull this card? If it's against a card like P.E.K.K.A, then obviously you can use a Goblin Gang to pull it, and that's probably a better use of your elixir. But if it's a card like E-Giant that targets buildings, then a mortar might be the right play. The second question that you need to ask yourself is the mortar going to be the best defensive card that you can play? If you're going to be playing it against a high HP non-building targeting card, is it really worth playing the mortar? That damage isn't going to be worth it. But on the other hand, if you're playing it to take out things like Goblin Gang, Barbarians, or even if your opponent has a ton of princesses, then it might make sense to play that defensive mortar. Now, do you guys remember when I was talking to you and I said that your Knight and your Musketeer or Little Prince, depending on which deck you're using, is going to be the foundation of your deck? That doesn't change here. That's the most important part for defending here. So imagine I have a defensive mortar right here. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be playing my Knight in front to tank anything that's behind their push, or pull anything that's in their push, and I'm going to play my Musketeer either right here or right here. If my opponent has Fireball or Poison, I wouldn't be playing my Musketeer right here. I would probably play it to the left. But if they don't have Fireball or Poison, then you can go ahead and play your Musketeer anywhere within here. So when you're going to be defending, you play the defensive mortar first, then you play the Knight in front of the defensive mortar, and that's going to pull and tank, and then you play your Musketeer down low. And if you need additional support, then you can go ahead and play your Spear Goblins to the left side and spread them out. You can also use your Spear Goblins or your Goblin Gang to pull cards if you need to. Because those defensive cards stay alive, you're able to make your counter push, and that's why I told you guys earlier that your Musketeer or Little Prince and your Knight are going to be the foundational pieces of this deck. If there's one most important, crucial thing that you guys are going to take from this video, it should be the importance of the Knight and Little Prince combinations with your Mortar. You can see here I'm going to play my Little Prince down low, my Knight up high, and then I'm going to play my Mortar as the counter push, and that's 90% of the interactions. If you can aim for this, then you're going to get a lot of wins, and if you watch my future gameplay, you'll see that literally all it boils down to is me playing my Little Prince in the back, the Knight in front, keeping it alive, and then playing the Mortar to counter push. That's all you need for Mortarbait. Now remember, you don't always have to have the defensive Mortar down. You'll see here I use my Knight to defend, and I'm protecting my Little Prince, and I have the Spear Goblins there for support, and then I make my counter push out of that defense. Try to remember as well that every time you defend using your Goblin Gang or Spear Goblins, you're going to get a little bit of chip damage on your counter push, or they have to counter that. And that's the true strength of Mortarbait. Every single time you defend, you're making a counter push out of it, or at the very least, on the smallest interactions, you're getting a tiny bit of chip damage. Now, I also want to show you guys just a couple tips that I have for very random interactions, like Mother Witch, which is something that I know a lot of you guys struggle with. I literally just Fireball or Poison the Mother Witch every single time I see her. But if your opponent has Mother Witch and you have Fireball, one of my favorite one tricks to do is to let the Mother Witch get the Skeleton Barrel and let them think that they're going to counter it, and then Fireball last second. This usually catches my opponent off guard, and I get a ton of damage because of this. This same logic applies to cards like Firecracker or even Magic Archer. These cards get a ton of value, and so it's always just worth taking them out as soon as possible with your spell. The more value they're able to get out of those cards, the harder it's going to be for you to defend, and so if you want to defend successfully, just get rid of them as soon as you can. Another tip that I have is to use your spells defensively, specifically at the bridge. A lot of the time your opponent will funnel multiple cards right onto the bridge, and playing a defensive Poison or Fireball can give you a ton of value and help you defend very difficult pushes that you might have had trouble defending if you hadn't used your spell in the first place. Another tip that I have for you guys is going to be against Bowler. How many times have you guys been playing a match and it's so annoying how your opponent just plays a Bowler in one lane and you can't do anything? If your opponent is doing stuff like this, go ahead and play your Mortar opposite lane and keep changing the lane up on them, and that's the best way that you're going to get damage and keep the pressure up on your opponent. And you can do the same thing if you're up against a card like Monk, where they keep playing it in the back or trying to play the Monk to plug up a lane. Just keep changing lanes up on them. Before we end off, I figured I would quickly go over all of the different versions of Mortarbait and substitutions that you can make for certain cards, because this is a pretty common question that I do get asked. The original version of Mortarbait runs Evil Mortar, Evil Knight, and Musketeer, and is also going to run Princess Tower. I would say that 90% of the time, the safest tower for you to run if you aren't sure which tower to run is going to be Princess Tower. Now, the second most common version of Mortarbait that you're going to see is the version that runs Little Prince. You'll see here I'm using Little Prince instead of Musketeer, and I'm also using Poison instead of Fireball, and you can swap these in however you like. You could run Musketeer with Poison, you could run Little Prince with Fireball, it really doesn't matter. One thing I will say though is you'll see I'm using Cannoneer, and I'm currently top 500 in the world running this deck with Cannoneer. But I would say that you shouldn't run Cannoneer unless you're struggling with beatdown decks. If you're having trouble against decks like Giant or, Golem or Goblin Giant, then Cannoneer might be a good choice. But if you are going to run Cannoneer, you have to run Poison. Another version of Mortarbait that you might see people play is they run Firecracker instead of Musketeer or Little Prince, and they use that as the Evo instead of Knight. And I have also seen people use Valkyrie instead of Knight in this deck. It's really just up to you and what your preference is. Now, a change that you might see with Mortarbait is going to be putting Evil Bomber instead of Evil Knight, and you're using the Bomber instead of Spear Goblins. I personally wouldn't recommend this, but this is a variation that you used to see a lot more common. You don't really see it as much anymore. And then one last change that you might see is putting Guards instead of Goblin Gang. Truthfully, I don't prefer these variations, but if you want to swap cards around, you can. Remember, everything is interchangeable. It doesn't matter what your combinations are. Just remember, if you're using Cannoneer, you need to use Poison. Alright, you guys, that's it from Professor Benny. I really hope that this video was helpful, and I hope that you guys learned something from this. If you guys do have any questions, as always, you are more than welcome to leave them down below, and I will answer them as soon as possible. But you guys are absolutely amazing. You guys make doing this so much fun, so I do hope that you guys enjoyed, and I cannot wait to see you guys in the next one.